Hello and welcome. You're watching Head to Head on UATV, and my name is Alexander Kerry. Fighting the corruption is on the top headlines in Ukraine right now. Economists say that it should not be a fight for elimination, but rather a struggle for changing the rules and reducing the risks of corruption itself for the future. So today we'll discuss these issues with Volodymyr Dubrovskiy, senior economist of Case Ukraine. Thank you for joining us.
Hi.
So our first question is a context question. The headlines today is that Trukhanov has been arrested. Recently, Nasirov, the infamous head of state fiscal service, has been fired. Is it a sign of a real change here?
Well, this is a minor sign because the real fight is not against the corrupt people, but against the corruption as a phenomena. And the corruption as a phenomena it should be treated a little bit differently than it usually is, because actually we live in the what modern political economists call a limited access social order.
Can you expand on that?
Yes. It means that the opportunities for the people are deliberately limited, and the access to lucrative economic resources, to politics and so on, is deliberately limited to certain people. And yes, of course, from the viewpoint of developed countries, we call it corruption. But actually, this is not a corruption of the system. This is the way the system functions. And it makes it much more complex, because it is not enough to imprison some this or that corrupt people. We need to fight the whole system. And the outrage against corruption is actually an outrage against the system. It is not the point that somebody is rich. It is the point that he or she is rich because of this limitation of access. Because if somebody will be rich and others will be also enriched by free market and so on, then it will be okay. But
sure, because it's by legal means and not by illegal ones, and that makes the difference.
Yes, of course, legal and legitimate from the viewpoint of free economy and so on. Whereas the problem is that and the people perceive it as injustice, because they are rich because of limitation imposed on the others.
It's, we're going to go to the free market interrogation after this, but you're saying it's engraved in the system, with my understanding. And in an article published in the Kiev Post, I think it was last year, it said the Russian proverb, "Laws are written for fools," is unfortunately one that characterizes Ukrainian society. So would you say it's a question of mentality?
Well, we have some problems of mentality, of course, but as well as other southern people, we indeed feel more responsible in front of our inner circle than in front of institutions. So before the institutions, we are feeling sort of negligible. Like many people in the southern Europe, Ukraine here is not an exemption. So we are prone to corruption, but it doesn't mean that we should say that, okay, that's our way of life. No way. We should just design the rules in such a way that they would be much more resilient to such kind of temptations and such kind of behavior, opportunistic behavior, than the northern European countries could allow. So if somebody says, well, let's see, in Sweden or in Germany or in Great Britain, it works perfectly, why don't we introduce the same kind of mechanisms in Ukraine? I have always a grain of salt about this, because let's look if it works, say, in Greece, in Bulgaria, or in Africa.
It's not exactly the same economy, is it?
Yeah. And the problem is that we also have this tradition that you mentioned. I mentioned in my article and you mentioned now. And this makes it especially vulnerable against discretion. because this is a famous formula of, again, famous anti-corruption expert.
Now, just let me just go back to Sujay. You said there would be a sort of a kit rules that to fight against corruption. Can you expand on that?
Yes. So I just you just interrupted me this place. Robert Klitgaard said that corruption is equal to monopoly plus discretion and minus accountability.
It's a formula.
Yes, this is a textbook of fighting corruption, and this is exactly the rules that should be applied in Ukraine. As long as we have problems with accountability, as lots of developing countries are, then we need to, first of all, reduce discretion to the possible extent. That's the main way of fighting corruption. Of course, there are some issues in which you cannot reduce the discretion, as for instance is in justice. The judge makes a judgment, otherwise he is not a judge. And that makes it especially cumbersome to introduce such kind of reform that would ensure some level of integrity, some level of controls, of checks and balances, and so on in this system. This makes it especially challenging. But in many other issues, like, say, in tax reform, which I'm involved in business regulations, even in traffic regulations, and so on, we can just reduce the discretion to the possible extent and get very good results. As, for instance, we had a tremendous problem of kickbacks with the VAT refund. And it was just because the state tax administration, headed by Mr. Nasirov and his predecessors, had last hand in this refund.
Now, you mentioned the free market. You mentioned the idea of business, and so it implies the idea of privatization. Now, I want to insist on that example because it seems to me that it's an interesting example. Privatization, over-privatization also mean that higher powers, higher enterprises can get a hold on certain assets. What and how to ensure that these enterprises, if we're talking about corruption, there's also a high level in corruption in the developed country you quoted, each other, but this corruption is a bit more hidden because it's a level which is so high that nobody sees it. How to ensure that it doesn't happen in Ukraine, that this privatization, this free market, doesn't open the door to another kind of corruption?
Actually, it will not open the door. The door is opened. So privatization just would mean that, of course, I'm not so naive to expect that there will be no corruption at all. But as of now, we have a situation in which the political parties compete for these lucrative positions that actually mean that the people who control these state-owned enterprises, as we say in our jargon, privatize the cash flows of those enterprises. And these cash flows are stacks in the game, the political game. So they make the whole political game dirty. And as soon as those enterprises will be privatized, then, of course, I'm also not so naive to expect that they will be privatized absolutely honestly, without any kickbacks and so on and so forth. But there will be no permanent rent anymore here. And there will be nothing in stake for this game. So at least it will make our politics less dirty as it is now.
So separating the economy in the real economy and those assets from the political game, and not necessarily having some, for example, deputies who have like a seat in an administration council in another.
Absolutely, it will be our political game, political life will be much healthier after that, and this means a lot because it will attract the people who would like to do something for Ukraine, not for privatizing the cash flows.
Now, you, in the same article I'm referring to, You also evoked the role of, quote, domestic expert activists as an important support to fight corruption. So for you, what are their real leverage on Ukrainian society, and how can they help Ukrainian society to fight against corruption?
First of all, I'm one of such experts, so I have
so you're more than concerned.
I should declare a conflict of interest here. But part of this, I think that it is very important that we now have a collective player, interested in further reforms in Ukraine for the first time in Ukraine's history, and this collective player actually is motivated, surprisingly liberal. So the most of those activists not try to redistribute state resources to this or that purpose as in many Western countries, but they try to implement some liberal reforms and some anti-corruption reforms. And they also serve as a watchdog against government officials. This is a mechanism of a part of the mechanism of checks and balances in the society, and fortunately, so far they have quite a big influence. Partly because they have good connections with Western partners, and the Western partners have good leverages over the Ukrainian government. This is fortunate for us that we are indebted and have to appeal to the IMF and so on for credits.
Which brings me to my last question to conclude this interview. This idea of some experts call it the sandwich model, which is some activists inside the country calling for Western partners to pressure on Ukrainian government. How long do you think it will last? How to guarantee it will last, and how to guarantee that the IMF, who already threatened and cut some loans for Ukraine, will not have Ukrainian fatigue, as some say the word?
Well, it's a good question. Actually, this works. This is a two-way road. On the one hand, we as activists appeal to the Western partners. On the other hand, the Western partners need us in order to realize what really happens, if they are willing to listen, if they will indeed do what should be done in this country, not what is written in their textbooks, like in the IMF. Then I think they will have success after success, and there is less chances for Ukraine fatigue. Otherwise, yes, there is such a danger.
And well, let's hope not. Well, thank you for this overview. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio. That was Volodymyr Dubrovskiy, senior economist at Case Ukraine. Thank you for watching the program. Stay tuned for the rest.